through their native plant fair. More at kingcd.org, helping build better ground. Baltimore, Maryland has created places for students to learn virtually in person.
It's a taste of normalcy. It's a taste of, okay, I have my academic day and I have my after-school program. And you can hear the laughter.
I'm Kai Risdal. How Baltimore is trying to support students who can't learn from home. That is next time on Marketplace at 2:30 and 6:30 p.m. on KUOW 94.9 and KUOW.org.
Right now, the record continues on 94.9 KUOW.
Day one of his presidency. That's when Joe Biden says the U.S. will rejoin the Paris Climate Accord, the global agreement to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. President Trump had pulled us out of that agreement. My next guest says rejoining the accord, that's the easy part. Here with the hard parts is the climate policy reporter at GRIST, Shannon Osaka. Shannon, welcome to KUOW.
Thanks for having me.
So after Biden rejoins the Paris Agreement, what is the difficult stuff that happens next?
Right, so Biden can rejoin the Paris Agreement really easily. It's basically like the stroke of a pen. It takes 30 days to be finalized. But by the end of February, we could be there. Now the problem is that you can't be in the Paris Agreement unless you have what they call a commitment in good standing. So that's kind of, international negotiation language. But basically it means that the U.S. needs to put up a promise to cut greenhouse gas emissions. And given the current makeup of what we think will be the Senate, which looks like it's going to stay Republican, it's going to be very difficult for President Biden to set a goal and then hit that goal.
So you said the U.S. would have to promise to cut greenhouse gas emissions. Would the U.S. have to promise exactly how we're going to do that?
Yeah, so basically what is required is you have to both say, we're going to cut emissions by X percent by some particular year. And so the U.S. is already going to be behind on our previous goal, which was we said we were going to cut emissions by about a quarter by 2025. We're not really on track to do that. And so the new administration is going to have to go to the next conference, which is going to be in Glasgow in November, and say, okay, here's how much we're going to cut emissions by, let's say, 2030, and here's our rough plan to do that. It doesn't have to be law, it doesn't have to be codified yet, but it's got to be something so that other countries will take us seriously.
Outside of the Trump administration, there have been more local groups trying to continue this work of greenhouse gas reduction all the last 4 years, groups like the We Are Still In coalition. So what have those groups accomplished, if anything?
Yeah, so those groups have been really good at basically keeping the momentum going. So they were started right after Trump said he was going to pull the U.S. out of the Paris Agreement. And it's basically an organization of cities and states and corporations who are all saying, okay, we're going to try to meet the goals regardless of what the federal government is doing. And so they've been very good at basically raising the ambition level. And a lot of companies are now coming out, tech companies especially, are coming out and saying, we're going to cut our emissions to zero by 2050, or to net zero, meaning that they're not going to put any more emissions out into the world than they're taking back in. And so the ambition is there. The problem is that a lot of these goals are kind of far off. They're saying we're going to cut by this much by 2030 or this much by 2050. And so it's hard to say right now about how far we're going to get on those goals alone.
Can you say more about what makes it so hard or so, something we can't count on to actually achieve promised goals like that? How's that work?
Well, part of it depends on how broad the goal is. So some companies say things like, we're going to run all of our operations, meaning our buildings and things like that, on renewable energy by X date. And that's sort of an easier goal to accomplish. But once companies say, we want to do all of our supply chain, make sure our entire supply chain is carbon neutral by this time period, that is pretty hard, and that involves sometimes multiple countries. It involves tracking a lot of different producers, and that's a huge lift for a lot of companies without any sort of government incentive behind it.
In fact, you've said that journalists like us need to do a better job explaining what a greenhouse gas reduction promise means and doesn't mean.
Yeah, in fact, one of my colleagues just released a video about this, but we basically need to be more critical than just repeating what the company says. If the company says, we're going to cut our emissions to zero by 2050, we need to look and say, okay, what emissions exactly are they talking about? Is this all of the emissions? Is this just the emissions from, for example, their buildings? And so journalists are going to really need to be on this, particularly in the next 5 to 10 years, of saying, okay, all of these companies made these promises. How many have followed through?
Right, and you hear a number coming from something like an oil company, whatever percentage is their promise, but a percentage of what? That's not necessarily that percentage of how much they emit overall.
Right, there are companies who say, we're going to go carbon neutral, and what they mean is that they're not going to use, basically, they're not going to create emissions in the process of pulling up fossil fuels, pulling up oil. But they're not including sometimes what those fossil fuels, that oil then does later on. They basically say, all we do is we're, extracting this oil, and then what the consumers do with it is sort of up to them. And so a lot of companies aren't actually incorporating all of their emissions.
I asked you generally about the work that's been done the last 4 years outside of the Trump administration. What about in Washington State? Do you have any sense of how Washington State has done in actually reducing emissions?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the most recent data that I've seen only goes through to 2017. And that actually says that Washington State has actually seen an increase in emissions between 2005 and 2017. It's not that much. It's only about 4%. But that kind of shows you what we're up against, because the problem in Washington is that we have a lot of really environmentally friendly people living in the state, and also the state's electricity. A lot of it comes from hydropower. A lot of it comes from renewables. So that's all great. But what that means is that Washington has sort of already taken care of the low-hanging fruit. Mm-hmm. So whereas, another state on the other side of the country might get a lot of bang for their buck by getting rid of coal, Washington, we're not really using any coal. And so then it becomes much harder to say, okay, where do we still need to cut emissions? We need to cut it from transport. We need to cut, some remaining natural gas emissions from the electricity sector. So it shows you that there kind of are limits to what a state can do by itself.
Yeah. My memory is that Puget Sound Energy still relies on coal a bit, but obviously not anywhere near the level of some other states.
Right.
And by the way, since I brought up Washington State, Jay Inslee, Energy Secretary, EPA Secretary, this is your beat. You hearing rumblings?
I think we'll have to see. I think that he's definitely going to be in the mix, but I'm not sure exactly where that will be yet.
Shannon Osaka is climate policy reporter at GRIST. So now let's go back inside the Trump administration. What did they do to American climate change policy in the 4 years they got?
It was pretty devastating. I mean, the Trump administration basically went in and systematically dismantled all of these environmental rules that had been set by the Obama administration before them. So Obama had this plan to, cut emissions from the electricity sector called the Clean Power Plan. The Trump administration repealed and replaced that with something that won't cut any emissions from the electricity sector. The Trump administration rolled back regulations on methane. They rolled back fuel economy standards for cars, just all of this stuff. And one of the problems is that you would think, okay, the new Biden administration comes in, can't they just undo all of that? Mm-hmm. And the answer is yes, sort of. The problem is that it's going to take a lot of time. Biden can't just come in and say, all right, I'm going to, with the stroke of a pen, undo everything that the Trump administration did on the environment. They're going to have to write new rules. They're going to have to repeal the rules that the Trump administration put in place. And all of this is going to take time, and in some cases, it's going to take years.
And what kind of support or opposition will Biden face in Congress and the newly constituted U.S. Supreme Court?
Yeah, well, so in Congress, it's going to be really tough. I mean, Biden's original climate plan that he sort of pushed during the election was that he was going to spend, trillions of dollars on clean energy, and also that he was going to eliminate emissions from the electricity sector. So that all sounds great. He can't really do either of those things without Democratic support in the Senate, without the Democrats controlling the Senate. And, we're waiting on those 2 Senate races in Georgia, but I, for one, am not optimistic that Democrats are going to pick up 2 Senate seats there. And so that puts him in a tough position in Congress, and it means that he's going to have to rely more on executive actions. But then the problem with relying on executive actions is that they are going to get held up in the courts. We have this highly conservative Supreme Court now, with some justices who have been fairly anti-environment in the past, and the Trump administration has also placed a lot of conservative justices in other areas of the federal court. So it's definitely going to be tough. I expect to be covering a lot of court battles in the months to come.
I am hearing about a possible bipartisan infrastructure bill, and you said that does have an effect on climate change. How so?
Right, so there are ways to use an infrastructure bill to do things like improving the electricity grid, improving transmission, and also a potential COVID stimulus bill, which hopefully we might see in early 2021. There's opportunities there to put in tax credits for clean energy, research and development into particular energy technologies. And those are things that you could probably get some Republicans to support. It won't be at a huge level. It's not going to be at the level of the trillions of dollars that Biden was hoping for. But there are possibilities there for Democrats to work with Republicans in Congress.
Okay, well, so much to be done, Shannon, so much compromise, as you say, to be needed. Is there anything that you are anticipating, let's say that always mark the first 100 days of an administration, on the topic of your beat, climate policy? Do you expect anything significant in Biden's first 100 days?
Well, I expect to see him rejoin the Paris Agreement and then make some pretty significant international moves to try to rally other countries to increase their ambition to cut emissions. So I expect to see that, and I'm really looking forward to just seeing what Biden's going to try to do executive action-wise, because there are lots of different options, and there's a limited amount of time. 4 years is not that long. The EPA staff has reached sort of historic lows, and so he's going to have to figure out how he wants to use that time and those resources. And so I'm interested to see whether he does try to issue some executive actions to cut carbon emissions sort of economy-wide.
We're looking beyond day one in the Biden-Harris administration, beyond just rejoining the Paris Agreement, what happens next? And Shannon Osaka's been walking you through it, climate policy reporter at GRIST. Shannon, thanks a lot for this.
Thanks for having me.
It's The Record on KUOW Seattle. The mayor of this town is coming up next to take your phone calls. Here's the number. You can call in right now, 206-543-KUOW, 543-5869. Stay tuned.